Hi students, welcome to lesson number 19 on women's movement in pre-independent and post-independent India. We are into the part A section. Now the introduction. The earliest women's movement can be traced back to 19th century social reform movement. Women's movement in India during the colonial era sprang from the same historical circumstances and social environment as earlier social reform movements in the 19th century, which sparked new ideas about diverse social institutions, practices and social reform laws. The intellectual and social content of the women's movement altered with time and has persisted into the present. Three main periods may be identified in the movement as a whole and they are phase 1, that is social reform movement, national movement and social reform legislation in the pre-independent era. Phase 2, women's movement in the post-independent period, and phase 3, women's movement in India since the 1970s. And the objectives of this lesson is that this lesson will enable the students to understand the status of women in India, and it will also throw light on various women movements in the pre and post independent India. Before understanding the women's movements in pre-independence and post-independence India, let us first try to understand the status of women in India. For the most of recorded history, patriarchy has dominated society. Since all women are categorized as being the same, discussing the position and status of women can be challenging. The status of women has undergone countless variations depending on culture, class, caste, family structure and property rights. The systems of marriage, descent, residence and inheritance are rarely set up in a way that gives women access to resources or enables them to secure access for other women, even if women have a right to kinship system. In fact, kinship, conjugal and familial structures under patriarchal rule have a tendency to create women in such a way that they scarcely live as independent beings and are only viewed in connection to males, robbing them of their selfhood and agency. The historical context that prompted and brought about social reforms must therefore be examined in order to fully comprehend the social reform movements for the advancement of women in India. Major change in women's status may be seen throughout Indian history, and some of these changes can be seen in the books that outline moral standards as so represent the time period's preeminent worldview. Now, what was the status of women in the Vedic period? In the Vedic times, the women had to face a world full of paradoxes. Women enjoyed high status in early Vedic culture and later it got deteriorated in the later Vedic period. They were allowed to organize Swayamvar and they could choose their significant other in their Swayamvar. However, women led a miserable wedded life as their spouses were allowed to have more than one wife. The men from privileged societies of the old Indian culture followed polygamy. Women were married up to the age of 16. Also, they had considerable freedom in terms of choosing their matrimonial partner. Manu, the father of Indian political theory, describes the position of women of Vedic age as a place of reliance and subordination. The classical political literature Arthashastra confirms that extensive limitations were placed on the development of women in the society. In terms of education, all unmarried women had to study. Several female saints of the Vedic period like Maitri, Ghosa, Gargi and Vak were highly skilled and learned as they composed complex Vedic stanzas for hymns. There are several verses in the Vedas that proves that women had the right to education. As a wife, women were given affection and respect, and as a mother, she was considered a figure of profound reverence. They were held in higher respect in India than in any other ancient countries. It will not be wrong to say that women enjoyed a much greater freedom and higher status in the Vedic period than in later India. Now, let us look at the status of women in the medieval period. The majority of the sources that can be used to recreate medieval India were written in the Indo-Persian tradition and were created in a court environment. We do not learn a lot about the women's activities or whereabouts. Women like Razia, Noor Jahan and Rudramma Devi are among the few women mentioned in the archives. Nonetheless, they are exceptions and cannot be generalized. On the home activities of common women in medieval times, we lacked information. During the Middle Ages, India underwent tremendous socio-economic transformation, giving rise to new social groupings that did not conform to old hierarchies. There are several inscriptions of recently formed groups that prospered as a result of economic changes, particularly agrarian growth and crop diversification. The Middle Ages saw the emergence of new polities across the subcontinent, which were not scattered remnants of a previous central government, but rather brand new formations brought about by the expansion of agrarian settlement and the ensuing increase in population. These newly developing social groupings try to redefine their place and status within the existing traditional hierarchy during the Middle Ages, and they led a movement that articulated their demands for the current system to be restructured. These saints introduced religion to the oppressed and subsequently marginalized elements of society by proclaiming that God dwells in each individual and that one might achieve God through faith. The Bhakti movement is the name given to this movement. The fact that women could now conduct Bhakti and were treated equally in God's eyes is what matters. The Lingayat movement, which Basavanna founded in the 12th century, repudiated many of the Hindu beliefs and practices, including sati and female infanticide, since in its founder's opinion they brought about disastrous to Hinduism. He supported the independence of women, their right to pick their own husbands, widow right to remarry and their right to divorce in certain situations. The introduction of Islam did not improve the situation for women generally, and many biases and prejudices persisted. The Arab and later Turkish invasion as well as the subsequent establishment of Mughal authority all contributed to the strengthening of the law and discriminatory practices against women. Women without parda were viewed as being shameless. They were harmed by the inheritance law, men's polygamy and the ease of divorce. They were denied an education. Their freedom and liberties were increasingly restricted. Households served as institutions where gender relations were structured, upheld and potentially challenged throughout the Mughal era. During this time, the harem changed into a confined area that may be compared to a family. The documentation of regular activities, including as a king's visit to the royal women, marriage preparations and gift giving, served as a rapporteur of the techniques used to create hierarchical relationships, forge alliances and strengthen kindred solidarities. The Mughal emperors made an effort to silence sati. Humayun established a license system to attempt to manage it. Akbar followed the enemy relentlessly. He was legally outlawed by Jahangir and Aurangzeb worked to see that this edict was followed. However, none of them were able to vigorously pursue these changes. Let us look at the status of women in the British period. The arrival of Europeans in India had no effect on the position of women. In ancient times, trade was a British first priority, just like other Western powers. Later, when they had to manage freshly captured territories, they decided it was safe to maintain the current social order while also bringing its religious gurus to interpret its laws as needed. Indians were first prepared for jobs under British rule with the advent of English schooling. This led to the emergence of upper class elites who started to question the validity of numerous social norms. British missionaries were encouraged to join their colonies and build schools, orphanages and destitute homes, particularly for widows, as a result of the creation and extension of British power. They opposed polygamy, child marriage, parda and sati. The new Indian elite, who had been exposed to the European liberalism of the 18th century through Western education, recognized the need for immediate social reform. In the following time periods, this led to evident results. Now, let us also look at the women's movement in the pre-independence India. The women's movement in the colonial period are mainly of two different concerns. First one, it is social reform movement and the second one, it is the nationalist movement. Now, let us look at what is this social reform movement started by the women. In the 19th century, a social reform movement gave birth to the first women's movements. Both the Indian economy and society underwent change as a result of the British conquest and dominance over the country. The British introduced new land revenue settlements, commercial agriculture and infrastructure including roads, trains, postal services and telegraphs, which had a tremendous impact on the economy of Indian villages. The development of Western educational institutions that provide modern education was prompted by the need for a new type of educated personnel in the new economic system and administrative apparatus. Indians who benefited from the new economic system were drawn to it, which led to the emergence of a new class of intelligentsia in Indian society. The well-educated elite became the forerunners of all progressive democratic movements, including those in social, political, economic and cultural spheres. The concepts and changes that were to be prompted in the reform movements were not uniform and differed widely. However, they did have a common interest in eliminating social ills, partially in response to the colonial authorities' acquisition of barbarism. This was a time when colonial ideology was under hegemonic dominance and influence. It was a period of transition marked by the emergence of the bourgeoisie and the values of new school of thoughts. The 19th century colonial intrusion encroached on our culture and society, which led to changes in our social structure. The Indian intellectual reformers who had been exposed to Western concepts and ideals felt this possible threat. All the social reformers shared a belief common to many parts of the world in the 19th century that no society would progress if its women were backward. To the reformers, the position of Indian women as it was in the 19th century was abysmally low, and hence their efforts were created at an overall improvement in the status of women through legislation, political action and propagation of education. This was mainly spurred by the first wave feminism of the West and concentrated on basic rights for women. The social reform movement did not radically challenge the existing patriarchal structure of society or question gender relation. They picked up reform only on those issues which the British were pointing out as evidence of degeneration in the Indian society. Even the institutions and organizations for women that emerged during this time did not demonstrate the emergence of an independent viewpoint. As a result, even when speaking for themselves, women could only use language that was determined by masculine standards and was used by men. Women were viewed as the obedient beneficiaries of more humane treatment from elite males who had received Western education. Thus, efforts were made to reform women rather than the societal structure that prevented them. There were no attempts made to change the men-women relationships and the power structure in the community. This was only reasonable given that the only way to transform the condition of women was to confront patriarchy itself. So, in order to fit the new emergent society, an attempt was made to construct a new Indian woman who was both authentically Indian and properly educated and trained in the 19th century principles. Therefore, education for girls was not intended to prepare them for becoming independent, rather self-sufficient and emancipated, as well as to prepare them for a particular career, but rather to be good housewives. Although leaders like Gandhi encouraged them to do so, women's contribution to the anti-colonialist movement were merely an extension of their domestic labor. Very few women were permitted to fight with males in front lines, and those who did complain of the loneliness they occasionally experienced. Women's roles were being pushed toward a more traditional way of life as a sort of resistance to these new notions that colonialism brought to India. Despite its flaws, it cannot be disputed that the social reform movement contributed to the elimination of barriers to women's education and gave them a voice in society. The reformers addressed issues like parda, female infanticide, polygamy, child marriage, sati, female infanticide and lack of education among women, among others. There were two groups of social reformers, liberal reformers and the revivalist reformers. Without a question, both groups recognize India's restrictive social institutions and norms. However, the former group presented their work for the cause of women on the basis of liberal philosophy, while the later group activity was based on a plan for the rebirth of the Vedic civilization in contemporary India. Social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Keshav Chandra Sen, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Kandukuri Veerasalingam, Pantulu M.G. Ranade, Karve, Swami Vivekananda, Swami Dayanand Saraswati and others gave leadership to the women's movement by openly acknowledging the subordinate position of Indian women. Social reformers focused on crucial issues affecting women: sati, the legal marriage age, the tragic solution of widows and the right to remarry. For the sake of Indian women, the social reformers founded a variety of societies including Brahmo Samaj, Ramakrishna Mission and others. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the first Indian to start a social reform movement and advocate for women's rights, was the best example of liberalism. He promoted gender equality and asserted that women were not morally or intellectually inferior to men. After female infanticide, Roy was made aware of the cruel practice of sati. He started actively propagandizing against sati through speeches and writings starting in 1818. The East India Company made the sati practice unlawful and a serious offence in 1829, largely as a result of Roy's work and influence. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was against early marriage, polygamy and other vices as well. He promoted intercaste marriage, widows and female education. He advocated for the inheritance and property rights of women. Women's rights reform efforts included a big contribution from Roy's Brahmo Samaj. The Brahmo Samaj immediately rose to prominence as a social reform movement, initially in Bengal. It then quickly extended to other regions of the nation, bolstering the number and power of regional reformist parties with like goals. The Brahmo Samaj opposed the caste system and focused heavily on improving the precarious conditions of women. They were instrumental in the development of a number of helpful policies. Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar assisted women in a similar way to Raja Ram Mohan Roy. By encouraging widow remarriage, he achieved this. Numerous young girls became widows as a result of the atrocity of child marriage, and their lives were terrible as a result of harsh limitations placed on them. In 1853, he released a paper on widow remarriage in which he argued in favor of the practice. Dayanand Saraswati founded the Arya Samaj in 1875. Dayanand Saraswati emphasized the importance of both boys and girls' compulsory education. The first coordinated effort by the Samaj to support women's education in a methodological way was the establishment of a number of schools for women known as Arya Kanya Patasalas. Leaders like M.G. Ranade, N.G. Chandrasarkar and R.G. Bhandarkar were part of the Pratna Samaj, which some Maharashtra Brahmins created in 1867. It placed more of an emphasis on supporting women's education. Both Brahmo Samaj and Pratna Samaj exerted great effort to show that the sad state of women in society was not justified by the Hindu religious heritage. In their efforts to raise a marriageable age, social reformers like Tej Bahadur Sapru, Bhairamji Malabari and Mahadev Govind Ranade claimed a number of incidents in young children as young as 10 or 11 were consummated, resulting in severe physical and psychological problems. A Parsi journalist named Bhairamji released his observations on forced widowhood and child marriage in 1884. He advised changes to be made in educational institutions to discourage child marriage as well as some corrective actions for the government. Between 1884 and 1889, the government came under intense pressure to pass legislation that would have raised the girls' marriageable age even more. The Age of Consent Act, which raised the marriageable age for females to 12 years, was finally approved in 1891 as a result of the reformers' combined efforts. The social reformers believed that by educating women, the societal ills associated with the problem of maintaining and bolstering the fundamental family structure could be eradicated and decent wives and mothers could result from the same. 48 girls' schools were created by Vidyasagar. In 1884, M.G. Ranade and his wife established a girls' high school as part of their efforts to promote female education. With the goal of empowering widows to support themselves, Karve launched the Ananta Balika Ashram for widow education in 1896 together with 15 of his colleagues. In order to counteract the orthodox sections opposing to women's education, he also established two distinct institutions for women, that is Mahila Vidyalaya in 1907 and SNDT Women's University in 1916. In its later stages, the social reform movement gave rise to female social reformers who fought for their own cause. In 1889, Pandita Ramabai founded Sharda Sadan in Bombay to give homeless high caste widows access to an ashram. Another widow, Sister Subbalakshmi, founded a widows' home in Madras in 1912 to 1913. Hindu women's property rights were a significant component of the social reform movement period of women's history in India. Raja Ram Mohan Roy advocated for the government to establish and implement legislations to eliminate these limitations and promote economic independence. These initiatives led to the passage of the Special Marriage Act of 1872, which included provisions for divorce and the transmission of property to women. The Married Women's Property Statute of 1874 increased women's access to property's ownership and broadened the definition of Stri Dhan, that is women's property. Additionally, it granted a widow a son-like share of the property and a life interest in her late husband's portion. Swami Vivekananda, Swami Dayanand Saraswati and Annie Besant were the prominent reformers of the revivalist group who also worked for the cause of Indian women. This group believed in the revival of the Vedic society in modern India. Dayanand Saraswati, the founder of Arya Samaj, was against child marriage. He encouraged women widow remarriage and also set up several rescue homes and orphanages. Annie Besant, leader of the Theosophical movement, was also against child marriage and supported remarriage of child widows. She laid emphasis on the importance of female education, just adding strength to the social reform movement, and Muslim women in India made little progress in their position both in the pre-British period or later British period. Western education, the major vehicle of progress during the British period, did not reach them, partly because of the existence of parda and seclusion of women from external environment and partly because education was considered inessential for them. Educated Muslims formed only a small segment of the population in the 19th century and were confined to urban areas in the country. Consequently, efforts in education and association formation among Muslim women did not begin until the 20th century, one notable exception being the Tayabji family of Bombay. Thus, the social reformers laid the foundation of the women's movement in India. Social reform movement was the first attempt to remove the obstacles in the life of women. It created awareness among the people that women must be liberated and be made equal to men. Now, let us have a look at the nationalist movement led by various women. Up until 1919, the nationalist movement was restricted to the urban upper class, and it was not until Gandhi joined the cause that the general public started to get involved. During this time, women's involvement in the national movement and political events went hand in hand. The nationalist initiation of the Swadeshi movement followed the partition of Bengal in 1905. Even though there was not a widespread awakening among women, gatherings were set up and ladies took up khadi spinning. Women sent the National Fund their bracelets, nose rings and bangles. Women in rural areas began setting aside a little amount of grain each day for this use. The Swadeshi movement was actively supported by the women of Bengal and Punjab. The Arya Samaj female employees were also in charge of fostering a sense of patriotism among the population. Rabindranath Tagore's sister Swarna Kumari and her daughter Sarala Devi were ardent advocates of the Swadeshi movement. Ms. Shyamji Krishna Verma, Mrs. P. Nauroji, Mrs. M. Chattopadhyay and Madam Bikaji Rustam were significant women who took part in the revolutionary operations. K.R. Kame, a regular among the Indian revolutionaries living in Europe, organized the actions of the revolutionaries. In order to reflect Indian realities, she also brought up concerns of women's equality in international socialist circles. This Swadeshi period marked the formation of several women's organizations. Sarala Devi took steps to organize women's movements and its nucleus in the form of Bharat Stri Mahamandal in Lahore in 1910. Branches of this organization were established at Allahabad and Calcutta. And the important achievement of women's movement in India during the second phase was the founding of Women's Indian Association, that is WIA, and Pandita Ramabai Sharda Sadan in Pune, Shri Mahipatram Rupram Anadh Ashram in Ahmedabad, Shri Zoroastrian Mandal in Bombay, Maternity and Child Welfare League in Baroda, Bhagini Samaj in Pune, all were established and worked with the particular objective of improving women's lives. These regional organizations were followed by national organizations like Women's Indian Association in 1917 and the National Council of Women in India 1920, and All India Women's Conference 1926 went on to organize 12 Women's Conference till 1937, and a Federation of University Women in India 1920 stimulated the interest of women in civic and public life and concentrated on the removal of disabilities of women and promoted social, civil, moral and educational welfare of women and children. The Women's Indian Association focused primarily on influencing government policy about issues related to women's suffrage, education and social reform. Its main goals were to increase women access to education, end child marriage and other social ills, give women the right to vote and achieve equality of rights for men and women. Up until its merger with the All India Women's Conference, this association was crucial in helping to define the women's movement. Women continued to advocate for political rights and social transformation during the Gandhian phase of the national movement by establishing organization. In 1919, Gandhi organized an all India Satyagraha to protest the Rowlatt controversial passage, where women participated in processions, promoted wearing khadi and even threatened to go to jail. Even though only a few women were detained, progress was nonetheless accomplished. Even though the non-cooperation movement was unsuccessful, it awoke women from all social classes and gave them their first introduction to Satyagraha. Indian women turned out to vote in the 1926 elections for the first time. Following the fight for the right to vote, women were only permitted a very limited amount of franchise. Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay was the initial female candidate. Dr. Muthu Lakshmi Reddy was the first woman to be nominated by a state to the Legislative Council, and she came from Madras. She oversaw the passing of legislation to end the Devadasi system, shut down brothels and safeguard young girls. She fought to establish health schools and brought changes to the Children's Act. Sarojini Naidu was one of many ladies who actively participated in the Dandi March. Women took part in processions, picketed schools, colleges, legislative bodies and clubs in violation of salt and forest regulations. Sarojini Naidu attended the second roundtable conference in 1931 on behalf of the Indian women. Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay spoke at gatherings and picketed stores selling foreign clothing and alcohol during the civil disobedience movement of 1930. She was in charge of the Hindustan Seva Dal's female wing. The Quit India movement, which was the last in the series of the nationalist agitation, was launched by Gandhi in 1942 with a significant slogan, "Do or die." Men leaders were arrested in the first roundup, and in their absence, women carried on the movement and bore the brunt of the British wrath. The women not only led processions and held demonstrations, but also organized camps in which they were given training in civil duties and first aid and were educated on democracy. Women organized political prisoners relief fund, while some women went underground and directed the movement secretly. In the Indian National Army of Subhash Chandra Bose, Rani Jhansi Regiment was created for women. Women were trained in nursing, social service and to use weapons. Thus, women took part in various activities of the national movement.